Kate, do you know what? No Korean man will ever touch a body like yours.
No Korean man will ever touch a body like yours. Kate Frimpong's mother said it in a back hallway, certain that no one but her daughter could hear her. She was wrong about that. For steps behind her stood the most dangerous Korean man alive. He had heard every word. And before the night was over, he was going to make every person who had ever made Kate feel small understand exactly what they had done. Her name was Kate Frimpong, 31 years old, 6 feet tall, full and soft and curved the way her grandmother had been curved. Deep brown skin with a warm golden undertone. A halo of natural hair held back at the crown by a thin gold silk band. A small pearl charm at her left wrist she did not take off for any reason. She was the only Ghanaian British pastry chef in London ever invited to design a centerpiece cake for the 80th birthday of Old Man Rowe, the patriarch of the Bay family. The kind of name people in the city said with a slight bow even when no one was watching. She had spent 9 days building that cake. She had carried it into the Bay compound that evening with her own hands. She had wiped down her workstation in the kitchen with the slow private focus of a woman who finds her religion in tidiness. She had stepped into a back hallway to fix the hem of her coat. She had not asked her mother to follow her. Her mother had followed her anyway. Mama Efua had reached up. She had tightened the collar. She had lifted her daughter's chin with 2 fingers, the way mothers in their family lifted chins when something needed correcting. And then, in the voice she had used for 31 years, the voice low and hard and almost gentle in its certainty, she had said it. Kate did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at this sentence the year she turned 25. Auntie Vita, standing 2 steps behind her sister, lifted her gold cross to her lips and gave a small approving nod. And then a voice came from behind them, calm, quiet, not loud at all. Madam, with respect, you are wrong about that. Kate's mother went very still. Auntie Vita's hand dropped from the cross at her throat. Standing in the hallway, one hand resting on the silver chain of a pocket watch at his waistcoat, in a charcoal 3-piece suit and a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled exactly 2 turns at the cuff, with a hairline scar bisecting his right eyebrow and a heavy silver signet ring catching the warm light of the corridor, was the man neither woman had heard step out of the private dining room. He was not looking at her body. He was looking at her face. The man's name was Ji Ho Bei. He was the grandson of Old Man Rowe. He was the head of the Bay family. And 2 hours earlier, in a basement room across town, he had ended another man's life over a glass of water and a finished cigarette without ever raising his voice. Before we go any further, I need you to know where you are. You have just walked into Afro-Korean Love Stories Vault. If this is your first time here, tap subscribe so that no story like this one ever passes you by again. Now sit with me, because what you just saw in that hallway is not the beginning of this story. It is only the moment the truth could not stay hidden any longer. We are going back to the morning of the cake. 5 in the morning, the blue hour, before London woke. Kate stood at her kitchen island in soft cotton clothes with no shoes on her feet. Her hair pulled back with a silk band, the pearl charm on her left wrist catching the lamplight each time she reached for the gold leaf. The cake stood 3 tiers high in front of her. Ivory buttercream so smooth it caught the light like cold porcelain. Sugar magnolias she had hand-piped over the course of 2 evenings. A single sugar chrysanthemum at the very top, the family flower of the Bay line, that she had built petal by petal over an entire afternoon. It was the most important commission of her career. It was also the only commission she had taken in 9 months. She had told her sister it was because she was being selective. She had told her mother it was because her business was growing. Neither was true. Kate had taken 9 months off because she had needed 9 months off, and the only person in the world who had understood why was the woman in the framed photograph at the corner of her counter. Her grandmother, Ma Aqua, the woman who had taught Kate to bake before she had taught Kate to read. The woman who had died on a Sunday afternoon 2 springs ago with flour still under her fingernails and a tray of spiced sweetbread cooling on her windowsill. Kate hummed her grandmother's song as she folded the last of the gold leaf into place. The same song her grandmother had hummed every Sunday for 64 years. She did not hear her sister come in. Lizzie Frimpong let herself in at 6 with 2 coffees and a face Kate had known her whole life. Lizzie was 24, slim and bright-eyed, with long box braids she had swept into a high ponytail that morning, a tiny gold stud in her left nostril, and the watchfulness of a younger sister who had spent her whole life learning her family from 2 steps behind her older sister's shoulder. Kate took the coffee without looking up. Lizzie said it as gently as she could. Mama is coming to the Bay compound tonight. So is Auntie Vida. Kate's hands did not stop moving over the cake. But her jaw set 1 degree. Lizzie said it again, softer. She said she would not. She said you asked her not to. And then she changed her mind. Kate said nothing for a long moment. Then she said finally that she would handle it. She had handled it every other time. She would handle it this time too. Lizzie reached across the island and put her hand on Kate's wrist, on the small pearl charm. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Across the city, at the same hour, in the basement room of a townhouse the Bay family did not own on any public deed, a different scene was happening. The room had concrete walls and a single low bulb, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with weather. A small steel table sat in the center of it. A man sat on one side of the table with his hands flat on the metal. His fingers spread, his eyes too wide, his shirt collar damp. His name does not matter. He had been the family's 3rd bookkeeper for 9 years. He had begun taking small sums in the 2nd year and larger sums in the 7th. On the other side of the table sat Ji-ho Bei. He had not removed his jacket. He had not loosened his tie. There was a glass of water in front of him he had not yet touched. A cigarette burned slowly in the ashtray at his elbow. Ji-ho lifted the cigarette. He drew on it once. He set it back down. He asked the man, quietly, how long he had been taking from the family. The man began to explain. He spoke quickly at first. He spoke about a wife, about a daughter who needed a school, about a brother whose surgery was not covered, about a debt to a cousin, about a moment of weakness that had become a habit, about how he had always meant to return the money, about how he had been waiting for the right time. Ji-ho did not interrupt him. The cigarette burned down a 1/4 inch. The man spoke faster. He spoke about his loyalty, about the years, about what he had built for the family, about the names he could give, about the rivals he had heard speaking, about anything that would fill the silence. The cigarette burned down another 1/4 inch. The man's voice began to crack. Ji-ho lifted the cigarette again. He drew on it slowly. He let the smoke out through his nose. He did not blink. When the cigarette had burned down to the filter, Ji-ho stubbed it out in the ashtray. He picked up the glass of water. He drank exactly half of it. He set the glass back down on the table. He stood up. He fixed the cuff of his right sleeve. He looked at the man's face for 1 full second. He did not say anything more. Yoon Choi stepped forward from the corner of the room. He had not made a sound the entire time. He walked to the door. Ji-ho walked out. The door closed behind him. Upstairs, Ji-ho washed his hands at a sink with a quiet stainless steel basin. He dried them on a clean white towel. He fixed the cuff of his left sleeve to match the right. He checked his pocket watch. He had 4 hours before his grandfather's birthday celebration. He had a long drive ahead of him. The cigarette had finished. The man at the table had finished. The morning continued. That same morning, in a city of 9 million people, a woman who had spent 9 days building a cake was driving toward a compound she did not yet know was about to become the most important address in her life. And the man who had hand-picked her name from a list of every pastry chef in London 9 months earlier was driving in the opposite direction toward the same gate. Kate did not know who had asked for her by name. She had assumed it was Old Man Rowe. She had assumed her work had been seen at a small gathering in Mayfair 9 months ago, where she had brought a single tray of her grandmother's spiced sweetbread as a test for a host she had been hoping to impress. She had assumed the patriarch of the Bay family had remembered. She had assumed wrong. Old Man Rowe had not remembered her name. Old Man Rowe had not been at the Mayfair gathering. His grandson had been. Ji-ho had stepped into a side room of a private gallery that evening looking for a man he was meant to be meeting. He had not found the man. He had found a Ghanaian British pastry chef in clean white kitchen clothes setting down a tray of sweet bread on a side table, with a small pearl charm catching the light at her left wrist. He had watched her hand the host's daughter a square of warm bread with a small private smile that lifted only the corners of her mouth, the gap between her 2 front teeth visible for half a second before she straightened up and looked toward the door. He had not introduced himself. He had left the gallery an hour later. He had not stopped thinking about her face. 9 months later, when his grandfather had begun preparing for the 80th birthday, Ji-ho had quietly suggested a name. He had said it without raising the suggestion to a level any other man in the family would notice. He had said it the way a man says something he wants very much but cannot afford to be seen wanting. Kate Frimpong. The commission had been issued by the household. The household had not known whose idea it was. Only Du-Yoon Choi knew, and Du-Yoon Choi had said nothing. Kate was driving toward the man who had brought her into this room before she had a name for him. She did not know any of this. She would not know for 3 more weeks. The Bay compound stood at the far end of a long quiet road in one of the wealthier districts of London, behind a tall white wall and a black iron gate. Kate's van pulled up at 7. The gate opened. The cake was brought through to the back service entrance. The staff had been briefed. They moved quickly, professionally, with the kind of hush that lived in houses where the noise of the day was always being managed for one man's ear. Kate followed the cake to the kitchen. She set up her station. She refrigerated the tiers. She walked the dining room with the household manager to confirm the position of the cake table. She returned to the kitchen. She tied a fresh apron over her chef coat. She checked her hands in the mirror by the side door. She fixed the silk band at her crown. She breathed out slowly once. Her mother arrived at 6 in the evening. Auntie Vita arrived 10 minutes later. The guests began arriving at 7. The string quartet began playing at 7:15. The cake was wheeled into the dining room at 8. Old man Rowe sat at the head of the table in a charcoal hanbok with white piping, his back very straight, his hands folded in his lap. The cake was placed in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. He did not touch it. He did not speak. He simply looked at it, the way a man looks at a thing that has reminded him of something he had not allowed himself to think about for a long time. Kate stepped back into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of cold water. She drank half of it. She set the glass down on the marble. Her hands were steady. They had been steady for 9 days. They were steady now. She stepped into the back hallway to fix the hem of her chef coat where it had caught against the trolley. She did not ask her mother to follow her. Her mother had followed her anyway. You know what came next. You saw it at the start of this story. What you did not see, because you were watching Kate's face, was what happened in the dining room 1 corridor away while her mother was hissing those words at her in the hallway. Old man Rowe had cut the first slice of cake himself. He had handed it to the woman seated on his right, his oldest sister, a woman in her late 70s in royal blue silk. She had taken a small bite. She had set down her fork. She had said quietly, in Korean, that she had not tasted bread like that since her own grandmother's village. Old man Rowe had nodded. He had cut a second slice and placed it on his own plate. He had eaten it slowly. Across the table, Ji-Yoon in slate silk had watched the room without smiling, because the man she had been promised to since she was 12 years old had stood up from the table without explanation and walked toward the back hallway. She had not known why. Ji-Ho had not known why either. He had only known that he could not sit at that table for another minute without finding the woman who had made the cake. He had stepped into the back hallway just as Mama Efua had reached up to tighten her daughter's collar. He had stopped at the door. He had heard every word, and he had not been able to keep his mouth shut. He stepped forward. Madam, with respect, you are wrong about that. Mama Efua's mouth opened. No sound came out. Auntie Vita's hand dropped from the cross at her throat. Ji-Ho did not look at either of them. He looked at Kate. He told her, quietly, that he hoped his grandfather's enjoyment of the cake had reached the kitchen. Kate, in the smallest voice she had used all day, said that she was glad. He told her that his grandfather had not eaten cake in 8 years. Kate did not move. He told her that his grandfather had said her bread tasted like his own grandmother's village. Kate's mouth moved. She did not quite smile, but the gap between her 2 front teeth was visible for a half second before she pressed her lips back together. Ji-Ho looked at her for 1 full second more. Then he turned and walked back toward the dining room. He did not say another word to her mother. He did not need to. Mama Efua stood in the hallway for a long minute after he had gone. Auntie Vita did not speak. Lizzie, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway at the very start of the exchange, stepped out of the hallway and back into the kitchen with her phone already in her hand. Kate followed her sister into the kitchen. She finished her glass of water. She set the glass down on the marble. Her hands were not steady anymore. An hour later, after the toasts had been spoken, after the second course had been cleared, after the string quartet had moved into a quieter set of pieces, Kate stood alone at her workstation in the kitchen wiping down the marble with the slow private focus of a woman who finds her religion in tidiness. The kitchen door opened. He did not enter the way men enter rooms they intend to take. He entered the way a man enters a room he has been thinking about all week. She did not stop wiping the marble. He walked the length of the kitchen and stopped at the far end of her workstation. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "My grandfather has not stopped looking at the cake. He has not eaten any more of it. He says cutting it again will end the moment." Kate's mouth lifted a quarter inch. She told him quietly that the cake was meant to be eaten. He said, "He knows. He is choosing to wait." She looked at him fully now. He was already looking at her. She forgot, for a half second, what her hands were doing. She reached for a piping bag at the corner of her station. He reached at the same moment to hand it to her. Their fingers met on the canvas of the bag. Neither of them moved their hand. The bag was held between them for one full breath. Kate did not look down. Ji-ho did not look down. He released the bag slowly. His thumb passed across her knuckle for a half second longer than it needed to. He did not pretend it had not. He said, "Thank you for the cake." He walked out of the kitchen. Kate did not move for a full minute after he was gone. She lifted her hand to her own wrist, to the pearl charm, to the only person who had ever loved her without conditions. She breathed out once, slowly. She did not name what had just happened. She knew. Across the dining room, at the same moment Ji-ho was walking back to his seat at his grandfather's right hand. Ji-Eum was watching him cross the room with a smile that did not reach the corners of her eyes. She had been promised to him since she was 12 years old. She had spent 22 years learning how to walk into rooms in the way a bay bride was meant to walk into rooms. She had learned which words to say. She had learned which to swallow. She had been trained from her adolescence to be the woman who could understand the cost of his life better than any other woman alive. She had felt the air in the dining room change at the exact moment he had stood up from the table. She had watched him return 10 minutes later with a different stillness in his face than he had taken with him. She had not seen him before. Across the city that night, in a different dining room in a much louder house, a man in a three-piece suit cut too wide and a deep red stone on his left pinky was being told, by a fixer who had been at the Bay compound that evening on a different errand, that the most feared man in the city had stood up from his grandfather's birthday table to speak to a Ghanaian woman in a back hallway. Sung Hyun Hwang had set down his fork. He had asked the fixer for the woman's name. He had written it on a napkin. He had folded the napkin twice. He had placed it in the breast pocket of his suit. He had smiled wide. His eyes had not participated. In a much smaller flat in a different part of London, that same night, Mama Efua had sat down at her own kitchen table with the matchmaker's number on a small white card in front of her. She had been waiting for a respectable Korean family to express renewed interest in meeting her daughter. The matchmaker had said earlier that day that such a family had quietly come forward. Mama Efua had not pressed for the name. She would press for the name in the morning. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest 2 weeks of Kate's adult life. Ji-ho did not call her. He did not ask Lizzie for her number. He did not arrive uninvited at her flat. He did not perform the way men in her past had performed. He commissioned a second cake. It arrived as a request from the Bay household 2 days after the celebration. A simple sponge for an internal meeting. The fee was 3 times what her usual rate would have been. The deposit was paid the same day. Kate baked the sponge. 3 days after that, he commissioned a tasting box. 12 small desserts. A request to deliver them in person. Kate delivered them in person. He was not in the room when she arrived. He was not in the room when she left. The tasting box sat on a polished table in the family library and a tray of cold tea waited for her. She set the box down. She arranged the desserts in the order she had thought through on the drive over. She wiped her hands on a small towel. She turned to leave. She paused at the door. She turned back. She lifted the lid of the small white sugar bowl in the corner of the room and tucked, beneath it, a folded paper square the size of a coin. On the paper was written, in her hand, the order in which the desserts should be eaten and the reason for each order. She had not been asked to write it. She wrote it anyway. The next morning, on her kitchen counter at home, she found a small envelope that had been slid under her door at some point before sunrise. Inside it was the paper square she had left under the sugar bowl. It had been refolded. On the back of it, in a different hand, in clean firm letters, was written one sentence. The order was correct. Thank you. That was all. There was no signature. She knew. 3 days after that, he commissioned a brunch service for a private meeting of family elders. He requested her by name in the household paperwork. He requested her presence at the meeting to plate the dishes herself. He did not look at her during the meeting. He did not speak to her. He sat in his usual seat at the table and listened to his elders without comment. When she stepped forward to plate the second course, his hand was resting on the table near the salt cellar. As she set down his plate, his index finger lifted from the table by a quarter inch and tapped, very slowly, twice, against the wood. She did not look at him. She did not need to. The tap was for her. That night, at home, Kate sat at her kitchen island for a long time without doing anything at all. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the apartment she had walked into 6 years ago. She thought about the sentence he had said to her in his living room with another woman's coat still over the back of his sofa. You were practice. She is the real thing. She thought about how she had carried that sentence in her chest for 6 years like a small stone she could not put down. She thought about Ji-ho's thumb passing across her knuckle for a half-second longer than it needed to. She did not let herself believe. She had been here before. She knew what believing cost. What Kate did not know was that 2 days after the brunch service, in the security office of the Bay compound, a young foot soldier of the family had made a joke about her body. The joke had been made to 2 other men. One of them had laughed. One of them had not. The one who had not laughed had been on the family payroll for 9 years and had known better. By the next morning, Deun Choi knew. By the afternoon, Ji-ho knew. The next day, in the main courtyard of the Bay compound, at 3 in the afternoon, every man in the family who answered to the household stood in 2 long quiet rows on the gravel. The foot soldier stood at one end of the courtyard. Ji-ho stood at the other. Ji-ho began to walk. The gravel made a small precise sound under his shoes. He did not raise his voice. He spoke to the foot soldier across the courtyard for the duration of the walk. The walk was perhaps 30 seconds long. The audience of his own men heard every word. The foot soldier heard every word. What was said is not for this telling. What matters is that by the time Ji-ho reached the foot soldier and stopped 1 step in front of him, the foot soldier had begun to weep. Quietly, without sound. With the kind of weeping that comes from a man who understands he has spent every year of his adult life in a particular shape and that shape has just been taken from him. Ji-ho did not strike him. Ji-ho did not raise a hand. Ji-ho simply stood in front of him for 10 more seconds, looking at his face, and then he turned and walked back down the courtyard to the house. Deun Choi nodded once. 2 men stepped forward and walked the foot soldier out of the gate. He was alive. He would remain alive. He would dream of that courtyard for the rest of his life. Every other man in the family understood the new rule of the house. The woman was not discussed. The woman was not named. The woman was not laughed about. 3 weeks after the celebration, on a wet Tuesday morning, Lizzie came into Kate's flat with the morning paper folded open to page 6. She set the paper on the kitchen island. She tapped the second column with her finger. Kate was making coffee. She did not look up. Lizzie read aloud. The article was short. A man's body had been found near the docks 2 weeks earlier. The man had been identified as a low-level fixer with rumored ties to the Huang family. The police were investigating his last movements. According to a source close to the investigation, the man had been part of a contracted team meant to extract a high-value visitor from an undisclosed private residence on the night of an undisclosed celebration. Lizzie paused. She read the next line slowly. The high-value visitor was identified in the article as a guest contractor. A chef. Kate set down the coffee spoon. Her hand did not shake. Her hand simply stopped moving. She looked at her sister. Lizzie did not say anything more. In the silence, Kate's mind moved very fast. The basement room. She had not been in it. She had not known about it. But she knew now. The cigarette finishing in the ashtray. The glass of water on the table. The drive across the city. The cake in the trolley. The kitchen. The piping bag. The thumb passing across her knuckle. Ji-ho had not been protecting his grandfather's celebration that morning. He had been protecting her. Before he had stood beside her at her workstation. Before he had said thank you for the cake. Before he had heard her mother say those words in the back hallway. Before Kate had known his name. Before Kate had known he existed. He had already chosen her. Kate lifted her hand to her own wrist. To the small pearl charm. Lizzie reached across the island and rested her own hand on top of her sister's. Kate did not speak for a long time. If you are still here with me, I want you to do something small for me. Pause this for 1 second. Tap the subscribe button so no story like this one ever passes you by again. Then go down to the comments and type, "I am enjoying it." So I know you are still with me, still feeling this story in your chest. Because what is about to happen in the next half is the thing every one of us has waited our whole lives to see happen to a woman like her. Now come back. We are not finished. That evening, Kate drove to the Bay compound without being invited. She did not call ahead. She did not stop at the gate to be cleared. The gate opened for her anyway. Yoon Choi had told the guard to open it for her at any hour of any day. The guard had not asked why. Kate walked through the main hall. She walked past the dining room. She walked past the library. She walked to the small private study at the back of the house where Ji-ho read at night when the family was asleep. She did not knock. She walked in. He was at the desk. He looked up from a small leather notebook he had been writing in. He did not stand up. He did not seem surprised. He set the pen down on the page. She did not sit down. She told him what she knew. He did not deny it. He did not explain it. He simply stood up from the desk. He walked around it. He stopped 2 steps in front of her. He waited. She asked him why. He looked at her for a long moment. He said 4 words. "Because I see you." Kate's eyes filled. She did not cry quickly. She cried the way a woman cries when 6 years of holding herself together collapses in one quiet breath. She did not cover her face. She did not look away from him. She simply let her eyes fill and let the tears come down her cheeks without trying to stop them. She had not cried in front of another human being since the apartment. He did not move toward her. He waited until she had stopped. When she had stopped, she looked at him. He looked at her. She walked the 2 steps between them. She lifted her hand to the lapel of his suit. Her fingers found the line of the cloth. She did not pull. She did not press. She simply rested her hand against his chest the way a person rests their hand against a door they are choosing to open. She kissed him. The kiss was brief and very quiet. He returned it with the restraint of a man who understood that the next thing in her life could not be a man who took more than he had been given. When she stepped back, his hand had risen, slowly, and his thumb passed once across her cheekbone, the way it had passed once across her knuckle 2 weeks earlier. Neither of them spoke. She turned and walked out of the study. He stood in the room for a long time after she had gone. What Kate did not know, as she drove home that night with the small smile of a woman who had finally let herself believe in something, was that earlier in the same afternoon, her mother had made a phone call. Mama Efua had spent the previous week hearing things she did not like to hear about her daughter. She had heard that Kate had been seen at the Bay compound 3 times in 2 weeks. She had heard, from a cousin who knew the household manager of a different Korean family, that Kate's name was being mentioned in rooms her daughter had no business being mentioned in. She had heard, from Auntie Vita, that the Bay family was not the kind of family a woman like her daughter could survive walking into. Mama Efua had loved her daughter for 31 years. She had loved her in the wrong shape, but she had loved her. She had panicked. She had called the matchmaker. The matchmaker had connected her, that afternoon, with the head of the respectable Korean family, who had been showing renewed interest in meeting her daughter for the past 3 weeks. The voice on the other end of the line had been wide and warm. Sung Hyun Hwang had listened to Mama Efua for the duration of the call. He had thanked her. He had hung up. He had written a new name on a fresh napkin. He had folded the napkin twice. He had placed it in the breast pocket of his suit. His eyes had not smiled. 2 days later, Lizzie did not come home from work. Kate called Lizzie's phone. It rang until it did not. Kate called her parents' house. No answer. Kate drove to her parents' house. The front door was open. Mama Efua was sitting at the dining table with her hands clasped in front of her. Her gold cross hanging too still at her throat, the matchmaker's white card on the wood in front of her. She had spent the previous hour understanding, 15 minutes too late, what she had done. Kate's phone rang. The voice on the other end was wide and warm and theatrical. Sung Hyun Hwang welcomed Kate to the conversation. He told her, in the voice of a man telling a friend a small piece of personal news, that he had a young woman in his care who looked very much like Kate. He told her it would be a great sadness if this young woman were to come to harm. He told her there was a way for nothing to come to harm. He wanted Kate to walk away from the Bay family, publicly, loudly, in a way the entire city would hear about by morning. He wanted Kate to humiliate Ji-ho Bay in a way Ji-ho Bay had never been humiliated. He gave her until midnight. He hung up. Kate sat down on her mother's floor. She did not weep. She did not move. Mama Efua slid down out of her chair and onto her knees in front of her daughter. She placed her hands on Kate's shoulders. She said her daughter's name 3 times in a voice Kate had not heard come out of her mother's mouth in 20 years. She said, "Forgive me. Please, forgive me." Kate did not answer. Mama Efua's head went down onto her daughter's shoulder. Kate sat very still. Then she lifted her phone. She called a number she had had memorized for 3 days and had not used. Diyun Choi answered on the first ring. She told him everything in 5 sentences. He told her to stay where she was. He hung up. Ji-ho received the call in his grandfather's study. Old man Ro was in the room. He was sitting in his high-backed chair near the window, the small black cane resting against his knee, a cup of cold tea on the side table beside him. He had not spoken for the duration of the call. Ji-ho ended the call. He placed the phone on the desk. He stood for a long moment with his back to his grandfather. Old man Ro spoke. He spoke in the voice of a man who had outlived everyone who had ever tried to underestimate him. He spoke in the voice of a man who had buried his only son. He told Ji-ho quietly that the family could not afford an open war with the Huang family. He told Ji-ho that the right move was to negotiate. He told Ji-ho that women had been lost to this life before, and the family had continued. Ji-ho turned to face his grandfather. He did not argue. He walked to the desk. He removed the silver signet ring from his right pinky and set it on the wood in front of his grandfather. He took the gold pocket watch out of his waistcoat pocket and placed it face up on the desk beside the ring. He looked at his grandfather for one long moment. He said, "Forgive me, grandfather." His grandfather did not speak. Ji-ho turned to Diyun Choi at the door. He said 4 words. "Bring everyone we have." 2 cars left the Bay compound at the same time. 11 men in each. Black suits. No talking. The cars moved through the night without sirens, without speeding, without anything that would draw the eye of a city that had learned long ago to look away from cars that moved like this. The Huang holding facility sat on the south edge of the city, in an old warehouse district where the streetlights had been broken for a year and no one had asked who broke them. The cars stopped 1 street away. The men got out. Ji-ho walked at the front. He did not have his ring. He did not have his watch. He did not have anything to lose. What happened in the warehouse that night will not be told here in detail. It is enough to say that Ji-ho's hands did what Ji-ho's hands had done before. It is enough to say that Sung Hyun Huang did not leave the warehouse on his own feet. It is enough to say that by the time the sun came up, the city's quietest rooms had heard that the second family had become a memory. Lizzie was found in a back room. She was bound at the wrists. She was unhurt. Diyun Choi wrapped her in his own coat and walked her out himself. Kate was brought to the warehouse by Do Yoon's second car. She ran to her sister first. She held Lizzie until Lizzie could stand on her own. Then Kate turned and looked across the warehouse floor for Ji-ho. He was standing at the far end, hands at his sides, a small thin line of blood at his right temple, his white shirt no longer white. He did not move toward her. He waited. She walked the length of the warehouse floor to him. When she reached him, she did not speak. She lifted her hand to his face. Her thumb passed across the line of blood at his temple very gently, the way his thumb had once passed across her knuckle, and once across her cheekbone. He looked at her. He said quietly, "You are not practice." Kate's mouth opened. She had never told him about Daniel. She had never told anyone. She had carried that sentence in her chest for 6 years like a small stone. He had known. He had known the whole time. He had known what to say to her before she had been able to say it to herself. He had been waiting for the night he could give her back the sentence she had carried for too long. Kate broke. She did not break loudly. She broke into his chest with her hand still resting against the line of blood at his temple. He folded around her without lifting her, without performing, without doing anything except being the man she had waited her whole life to be allowed to lean against. 3 weeks later, at 3 in the morning, Kate could not sleep. She got out of bed and walked into her kitchen. He was already there. Sleeves rolled exactly 2 turns. Signet ring back on his right pinky. A small pot on the stove. The notebook from her counter open beside it. Her grandmother's recipe for spiced sweet bread written in her grandmother's hand across the page. He did not look up when she came in. He simply held out a small wooden spoon. She took it. She tasted. She closed her eyes. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He had been paying attention all along. 6 months later, Kate walked back into the house she had grown up in. Jiho walked one step behind her. Mama Efua was sitting at the dining table with her hands folded in her lap and the morning paper open in front of her, unread. She had been sitting like that for the past hour. She had not known her daughter was coming. She had only known, somehow, that something was coming. She had not been able to put her mug down all morning. Kate stood in the doorway. Mama Efua looked up. For a long second, she did not move. Then the chair scraped softly behind her. She stood up. She looked at her daughter, fully, for the first time in 31 years. Not the daughter she had been trying to fix. The woman she had become. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her hand went to the gold cross at her throat. It did not stay there. It dropped to her side. She said, in a voice Kate had not heard since they had been on a kitchen floor 6 months ago, "My child." Kate did not move. Mama Efua said, "I have rehearsed this for 6 months. I have rehearsed it every morning at this table. I have rehearsed it every night in my bed. I have rehearsed it in the shower and in the queue at the post office and on the bus to the market. And now you are standing in front of me and the words I rehearsed do not fit." Kate's eyes filled. She did not let them spill. Mama Efua said, "I want to tell you that I was wrong. I want to tell you that what I said to you in that hallway was the same sentence my own mother said to me when I was 15 years old in my father's kitchen. I want to tell you I have carried those words in my mouth for 43 years. And the day I said them to you was the day I finally became my own mother. And I have not stopped being sick about it since." Her voice broke. She did not stop speaking. She said, "You were never too much. You were never not enough. You were never the thing I told you you were. You were the most beautiful child I had ever held in my arms. And I was so afraid of what the world would do to a child like you that I started doing it to you first. So you would be ready. So it would hurt less coming from your mother than from a stranger. I told myself it was love. It was not love. It was fear wearing love's coat for 31 years. She paused. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She said, "I do not deserve to ask you to forgive me. I am asking you anyway." Kate's tears came down now. She did not wipe them away. She walked across the dining room, slowly, the way a woman walks toward a thing she has wanted to walk toward for a very long time and has not been allowed to. She stopped in front of her mother. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Mama, do you remember what Grandma used to say to me on Sunday afternoons?" Mama Efua's mouth lifted at the corner. A small broken half smile. She said, "She used to say you were her best Sunday." Kate said, "Yes." She said, "Mama, I am still her best Sunday. And I am your daughter. Both things are true." She said, "I forgive you." Mama Efua's knees gave way. Kate caught her under the elbows before she could go all the way to the floor. She held her mother up with both hands. Mama Efua's head went down onto her daughter's shoulder. She wept the way a woman weeps when she has carried something too heavy for 43 years and has finally been told she is allowed to set it down. Kate held her. Across the dining room, Jiho had not moved from the doorway. He had not made a sound. He had stood in the door of the house his future wife had grown up in, with his hands clasped in front of him, and he had let two women find each other in a room he had no business standing in. After a long time, Mama Efua lifted her head off Kate's shoulder. She looked past her daughter. "Toiho." She did not speak. He stepped one step into the room. He inclined his head. Just an inch. The smallest bow a man in his world could give to a woman of her age. The kind of bow that said, "I see you and I am thanking you." Mama Efua's hand lifted to her mouth. Jiho said quietly, "Mother." It was the first time anyone had called Mama Efua that and meant it as a word of belonging, not a word of obligation in all the years she had been a mother. Her face broke open all over again. She let go of Kate. She walked across the dining room, 3 small steps, and she stopped one step in front of the man her daughter had chosen. She lifted her hand. She placed it very gently on Jiho's cheek. She said, "Take care of her." He said, "I will not stop." She said, "Take care of yourself too." He did not answer that one for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I will try." She lowered her hand. She turned. She walked back to her daughter. She took Kate's face in both of her hands. She kissed her forehead. She held her daughter's face for one more second. She said, "My Sunday." Kate said, "Mama." That was all. 3 months after that, Mama Efua flew to Ghana for the first time in 19 years. The plane landed in Accra at 6 in the morning. A driver was waiting for her at arrivals with her name written on a small white card in clean black letters. She had not been told there would be a driver. She had been told to expect a taxi. She had not been told many things. The car drove for 4 hours outside the city, into the green country roads she had not seen since her own mother's funeral. She watched the road through the window. She did not speak to the driver. The car stopped at a small white painted house with a blue gate. A woman opened the gate from the inside. The daughter of Mama Efua's oldest cousin. She had not seen Mama Efua since she was a small child. She greeted her with both hands. The house had been freshly painted. The garden had been swept. A small black goat was tied under the mango tree at the side of the yard. The mango tree her own mother had once sat under 60 years ago with a basket of green beans on her lap. Mama Efua walked through the rooms of the house without speaking. The kitchen had a window that opened out onto the mango tree. The bedroom had a bed already made. White cotton sheets. A blue blanket folded at the foot. A small wooden table beside the bed. On the wooden table was a framed photograph. Mama Efua picked it up. The photograph was of Kate. A baby. 6 months old maybe. In her grandmother's arms in the same kitchen Mama Efua was now standing in. Ma Acua, holding her granddaughter, looking down at the small face with the small gap already beginning to form between the two front teeth. Mama Efua sat down on the edge of the bed with the photograph in her hands. Her phone rang in her bag. She lifted it out. She looked at the screen. She answered. Kate's voice came through. Mama, are you there? Mama Efua could not speak for a long moment. Kate said gently, are you in the kitchen? Mama Efua said, I am in the bedroom. Kate said, did you find it? Mama Efua said, yes, I found it. Kate said, his mother had it for me. She gave it to him the night you came to dinner 6 months ago. He has been keeping it. He told me last week that he wanted you to find it on your own, in your own time in your mother's house. Mama Efua said, my child. Kate said, Mama, I love you. Mama Efua said, I love you. I love you. I love you. She said it 3 times. Kate said, sit by the mango tree this afternoon. Grandma used to sit there. Mama Efua said, I know. Kate said, I will call you tonight. Mama Efua said, please. Kate said, Mama, before I go. He says hello. Mama Efua looked down at the photograph in her hands. She lifted her thumb to the small face in the picture. She brushed the picture gently with her thumb. The same way the man in her daughter's flat in London had once brushed her daughter's knuckle in a kitchen with a piping bag held between them. She said, into the phone, tell him thank you. Tell him I do not know how to say it bigger than that. But tell him thank you. Kate said, I will tell him. They stayed on the phone in silence for 7 minutes. 2 women, one in a flat in central London with a man on the sofa behind her reading a paper. One in a bedroom in a small white house outside Kumasi with a framed photograph of a child in her hands, breathing into the same line of air. A year later, on a Saturday morning in central London, a small bright dessert house opened its doors for the first time. The sign above the door read, in soft gold lettering, Frimpong and Bay. Below the names, in smaller letters, were the words, since the day she made the cake. Kate had not chosen those words. Jiho had. She had cried in the workshop 2 weeks before, when she had seen the finished sign laid out on a long wooden bench, the gold lettering still drying. He had been standing across the workshop with his hands in his pockets and his head slightly tilted, the way he stood when he had done something he was not quite sure how to apologize for. She had walked the length of the workshop floor to him and kissed him in front of 3 carpenters and a sign painter without caring that any of them could see her. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now the doors of the dessert house were opening for the first time. The first guests began to come in. The first cake in the front case was a small spiced sweetbread that smelled like a Sunday afternoon. Beside it sat a small framed photograph of a Ghanaian woman with flour under her fingernails and a tray of bread cooling on a windowsill behind her. Old man Ro sat by the window in a wheelchair. Diyun Choi had wheeled him in himself. A small plate of the sweetbread sat on the table in front of him. He was eating it very slowly. He was smiling the way men in their 80s smile when they have remembered something they did not know they had forgotten. A young woman who had come in for a coffee stopped to ask him what he was eating. He said, in careful English, my grandmother's bread. The young woman said, oh, is your grandmother Ghanaian? He said, no. My grandmother was Korean. She lived in a small village outside Daegu. She made a bread like this when I was a child. I had not tasted bread like this in 70 years. The young woman said, but this is a Ghanaian bread. He said, yes. He said nothing else. The young woman did not understand. She nodded politely and walked away with her coffee. Old man Rowe ate the rest of his slice. His eyes did not leave the photograph on the front case. Behind the counter, Lizzie stood in chef whites of her own. Her box braids were pulled up into a high knot. A small pearl charm hung at her own left wrist. Kate had given it to her 3 months ago. She had not taken it off since. Kate stood at the doorway between the kitchen and the front of the shop. She watched the morning come in. Ji-ho appeared at her shoulder. He did not speak. He put one hand at the small of her back. That was all. She leaned half an inch into the hand. That was all. 2 years on a quiet evening at the Bay compound, Kate sat at the small dining table in the family library reading a notebook her grandmother had once written recipes into. The fire was lit. The lamps were low. A cup of tea was cooling at her elbow. Ji-ho was not in the room. He had stepped out half an hour ago to take a call. She heard him come back in. He did not sit down across from her. He stood at the side of the table in his shirt sleeves, his waistcoat unbuttoned. His sleeves rolled exactly 2 turns. He had a small velvet box in his right hand. She set the notebook down slowly. She said quietly, "What are you doing?" He said, "What I have been planning to do since the morning of the cake." He set the box on the table. He did not kneel. He did not perform. He sat down in the chair beside her instead. He turned in the chair so that his knees were facing her knees. Their feet were close enough to touch. They did not. He opened the box. A ring sat inside it. The same chrysanthemum crest he had worn on his right pinky every day of his adult life. Smaller. Made for her finger. The silver had been remade. The crest had been hand-engraved by the same man who had engraved the original 60 years ago. Kate did not breathe. He said quietly, "The night my father died, he told me 4 things before they took him out of our dining room. He told me to look after my grandfather. He told me to look after the family. He told me to be careful who I trusted. And he told me when the day came that I wanted to give a woman a ring to give her this one. Because, he said, the woman who deserved this ring would already know what it meant." Kate's eyes filled. He said, "I have carried this ring on my finger for 17 years. I have carried it through every basement and every hallway and every night I did not know if I would come home. I carried it the morning I drove to my grandfather's birthday. I carried it the night I went to the warehouse. I have carried it because I was waiting." He paused. He said, "Kate, marry me." Kate did not answer right away. Her hand lifted, slowly, to her wrist, to the small pearl charm her grandmother had given her. She touched it for a moment with 2 fingers, the way she always did when she wanted to feel the only person who had ever loved her without conditions. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of the kitchen in the village outside Kumasi. She thought of the song her grandmother had hummed every Sunday for 64 years. She thought of the framed photograph her mother had found on a bedside table 3 months after the dining room. She thought of the man in front of her. She said yes. Her gap-toothed smile arrived without her remembering to hide it. He slid the ring onto her finger. He lifted her hand to his mouth. He kissed her knuckle where the ring sat. The same knuckle his thumb had once passed across in a kitchen with a piping bag held between them. Then he said very quietly, against the back of her hand, "Thank you for saying yes." She said very quietly, "Thank you for asking." He lifted his head. He looked at her. He said, "My father would have loved you." She said, "My grandmother would have fed him too much sweet bread." He smiled. The corners of his mouth lifted 1 degree. The way they only ever lifted for her. He said, "She would have, would she?" She said, "Yes." And he would not have minded. He kissed her then, very softly, in the lamplight, in the library where his father had once told him 4 things in the last 20 seconds of his life. 8 months later, on the morning of their first wedding anniversary, Kate stood in their kitchen in a soft gray robe with her hand resting on the marble. Ji-ho was at the espresso machine. He had not turned around. She said quietly, "I have something for you." He said, without turning, "What kind of something?" She said, "The kind you have to come over here to see." He turned. He looked at her face. He set down the cup. He walked across the kitchen. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small piece of folded paper, a square the size of a coin, the same way she had once left a paper square under a sugar bowl in his family library. He took it. He unfolded it. On the paper in her hand were 2 lines. The first line was a date, 8 months away. The second line said, "The order will be 3 this time." He stared at the paper. He looked up at her face. He did not speak. She nodded. His hands went very still. His eyes did not. He set the paper down very carefully on the marble. He lifted her hand. His thumb passed across her knuckle. Then he placed her palm against his own cheek. He said quietly, "Are you sure?" She said, "The doctor is sure." His eyes closed. For the first time in this entire story, the man whose face had not moved through executions, the man whose hands had not shaken through every cold morning of his adult life, the man whose stillness emptied rooms, lost his stillness. His shoulders moved. He pulled her against him. He held her in the kitchen for a long time without speaking. When he finally let her step back, he placed both his hands on the marble on either side of her, and he leaned his forehead against hers, and he said very quietly, "I did not know I was allowed to want this." She said, "You are." She said, "You have been allowed to want this for a long time. You just did not know." He said, against her forehead, "What should we name her?" Kate's smile arrived again. She said, "You do not know it is a girl." He said, "It is a girl." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I would know." She laughed, quietly, into the space between them. She said, "If it is a girl, Acua." He said, "After your grandmother." She said, "Yes." He said, "Acua Bay." She said, "Acua Bay." He said again into her hair, "Acua Bay." For years after that, on a Sunday morning, in a bright airy house at the edge of the city, a small girl with a gap between her 2 front teeth and a halo of natural hair tied back with a thin gold silk band was running through a kitchen in mismatched socks. Her name was Acua. She was 4 years old. She had been named for her great-grandmother, Ma Acua, the woman who had taught Kate to bake before she had taught her to read. The woman in the framed photograph in the front case of Frimpong and Bay. Kate was at the island kneading dough. She was barefoot. Her own hair was pulled back with the same thin gold silk band she had worn the night she had carried a cake into the Bay compound for the first time. The pearl charm at her left wrist caught the morning light. Ji-ho was at the other end of the island, reading the paper, signet hand resting on the marble, sleeves rolled exactly 2 turns at the cuff. The gold pocket watch lay open on the marble beside his coffee. Acua climbed onto the stool beside her mother first. She said, "Mama, can I help?" Kate said, "Yes." She tore off a small piece of dough. She put it in Acua's small hands. Acua pressed it flat with her thumbs the way her mother did. She looked up at her mother's face. She said, "Mama, why do you always touch your wrist?" Kate paused for a moment in the kneading. She looked down at her daughter. She said, "Because my grandmother gave me this charm when I was a little girl. And whenever I touch it, I remember that she loved me." Acua said, "But she is not here anymore." Kate said, "No, she is not." Acua said, "Then how do you know she loved you?" Kate breathed out, slowly. She said, "Because she taught me to bake. Because she taught me to sing. Because she told me, every Sunday, that I was the best thing she had ever held in her arms. And because, even after she was gone, every time I needed to remember it, I could touch this charm and I would hear her voice." Acua thought about this for a moment. She said, "Can I touch it?" Kate held out her wrist. Acua pressed her small thumb against the pearl. She said, "Hello, great-grandmother." Kate's eyes filled. She did not let them spill. She kissed the top of her daughter's head. She said, "She would have loved you so much, my little Acua. She would have spoiled you with sweet bread every Sunday." Acua said, "What is sweet bread?" Kate said, "I will show you. After breakfast." Acua said, "Promise?" Kate said, "Promise." Acua climbed down off the stool. She crossed the kitchen to her father. She climbed into his lap. She demanded a story. He lowered the paper. He looked across the kitchen at her mother. Her mother was already looking at him. The look held the entire story inside it. Acua tugged at his shirt. She said, "Daddy, tell me a story." He said, "What kind of story?" She said, "The good kind. With a princess." He said, "What kind of princess?" She said, "The kind that wins." He looked across the kitchen at her mother again. Kate's smile arrived. The gap between her 2 front teeth visible without her remembering to hide it. Ji-ho lowered his head to his daughter's hair. He said very quietly, "Once upon a time there was a cake." Acua said, "A cake?" He said, "Yes. The most beautiful cake the city had ever seen." She said, "Who made the cake?" He said, "A woman who had been told her whole life that she was too much." Acua said, "But she made the cake?" He said, "Yes. She made the cake, and she carried it into a very fine house. And in that house there was a hallway, and in that hallway someone said something cruel to her. Acua said, "What did they say?" He said, "I will tell you when you are older." Acua said, "Did anyone hear them say it?" He said, "Yes, someone heard." She said, "Who?" He said, "A man who was waiting in a doorway." Acua said, "What did he do?" He said, "He stepped forward. And he told the person who had been cruel that they were wrong. And then he looked at the woman with the cake. And he never looked away." Acua said, "Did he marry her?" He said, "He did." She said, "Daddy, was the woman with the cake Mama?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Was the man you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Am I in the story?" He said, "You are the best part of the story." Acua was very quiet for a moment. She reached up to her father's face. She placed her small hand on his cheek. She said, "Daddy, tell Mama I love her." Jiho looked across the kitchen at Kate. Kate had stopped kneading. Her hand was at her wrist. The morning light was on her face. Her eyes were on her husband. Jiho said, "Your daughter says she loves you." Kate said, "I heard her." She walked across the kitchen, barefoot, the gold silk band at her crown catching the light. She kissed her daughter's forehead. She kissed her husband's mouth. She said, "I love you both. More than I knew it was possible to love." Acua said, "Mama, I love you bigger than the whole sky." Kate said, "I love you bigger than the whole sky and all the stars in it." Acua said, "Daddy, how big do you love Mama?" Jiho looked at his wife. He did not look away. He said quietly, "I love your mother more than I have words for, in any language I have ever learned, and I have learned 3. Acua nodded as if this answer was entirely reasonable. She said, "Okay, Daddy, finish the story." He lowered his head to her hair again. He said very quietly, "And they lived for a very long time, and they were never told they were too much again. Not once." He said, "The end." Acua said, "No, not the end." He said, "No." She said, "The beginning." Kate lifted her hand and let it rest at the small of her husband's back the way his hand had once rested at the small of hers at the doorway of a dessert house in central London. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The story did not need anything else. If the story stayed with you, tell me in the comments which moment between them you have not been able to put down. Tell me who you watched it with in your mind. And before you go, remember this. The right love does not come loud. The right love comes quiet. The right love comes from the man standing in the hallway behind you when the world is trying to convince you that you are not worth being chosen. Love, the real kind, the kind that survives everything, is always worth the waiting for. I will see you in the next story.